You tried everything. You rested for a week, you've been to the physio, you got massages, you did all the warm-ups out there, but your shoulder pain won't go away, then this video might have the solution you were waiting for. If resting, additional massages and additional warm-ups do not help, then maybe the root cause of the pain are the exercises and the exercise execution within the training itself. And in this YouTube video, we are going to look at a very common compensation that we see at a lot of athletes that join our coaching, and I will also show you how you easily can fix these compensations in order to make your shoulder pain go away. What we see in athletes that are very prone to shoulder discomfort is that they are not able to maintain a natural scapulohumeral rhythm. And what that is, I will show you on two examples, and the first one is a regular rowing pattern. Let's dive into the row, and you can now take a look at if you see a difference between those two reps. Now, in the first reps, I will row with a natural scapulohumeral rhythm. Now, in the second variation, I will use a technique which is, from our experience, very prone to shoulder discomfort, as it does not have a natural scapulohumeral rhythm. Could you spot the difference? The first example I showed you was for rowing movements, and the compensation works in a very similar fashion also for horizontal pressing movements. And now we play the same game. I show you two different variations. The first one will be with a natural scapulohumeral rhythm, and the second one will be with a bit of an unnatural pattern that is much more prone to discomfort. Variation number one. And now the more unnatural pattern that we see. Now that we saw the pattern on rowing movements and horizontal pressing movements, we can actually spot exactly the same compensation pattern also on vertical pulling exercises. So, can you spot the difference again? I think you're now getting pretty good at it. We will now start with a more natural pull. And now we're going in with a more unnatural scapulohumeral rhythm. Could you spot the difference? And as this is a weighted calisthenics channel, we of course need to also talk about dips. And as you can imagine, we can see exactly the same compensation pattern happening here as well. So you see, it is one inability to maintain a certain pattern that leads to a compensation movement on almost all upper body lifts. So, can you spot it again? Natural. And the compensation pattern. So all the compensation patterns that you saw have one thing in common, and that is that the athlete that is doing those compensation movements is not able to maintain a natural scapulohumeral rhythm. That means that the coordination of the scapular movement together with the movement of the upper arm in the shoulder socket does not work as it should work. In order to maintain a natural scapulohumeral rhythm, we want to have for abduction movements and the movements in that plane, so flexion and extension, a ratio of movement from the upper arm that moves inside the shoulder socket to the whole shoulder blade of roughly 2:1. That means if the arm is moving 2 degrees, the shoulder blade roughly moves 1 degree. And now I will explain to you why this is helpful and why this has a high chance of decreasing your shoulder pain if you learn to do that properly. In order to understand why not being able to maintain a proper scapulohumeral rhythm is more prone to shoulder discomfort, we take a look at the structures itself. For this consideration, we leave the rib cage out. That means we're not drawing the complete picture here, but for a basic understanding, that's more than enough. Most of the common shoulder injuries are overloading injuries or inflammations of the rotator cuff muscles. The rotator cuff muscles are different muscles around the shoulder joint which have primarily the function of compressing this part of your upper arm inside the socket of the shoulder joint, so that this part is not dislocating and it's always nicely centered in the socket. And the rotator cuff needs to work much more if we have a lot of relative movements between those structures. That happens if the natural scapulohumeral rhythm is not working properly. Because with a natural scapulohumeral rhythm, let's say we're looking at the movement of abduction. The natural scapulohumeral rhythm would be that we start the abduction and then the shoulder blade moves in a ratio of 2:1 upwards with the upper arm. That means the socket also points much more in the direction of the upper arm. That means the rotator cuff needs to do less work in order to maintain proper stability and integrity of that joint. Same happens for flexion movement and extension movements. If we bring the arm behind the body, the shoulder blade moves backwards and downwards with the arm. And so it is easier for the rotator cuff to compress it and center it in a joint. Hence, it can work more efficient. And as we know, with those overloading injuries, they tend to happen much faster if we don't have those natural rhythm, because then every row, every pressing movement, every overhead movement places much more demands on the rotator cuff. So the movement itself is not really problematic, but it leads to you being able to train much less volume, and you can use much less weight before that muscle overloads. So what you are able to do if you learn to do those movements more properly is that you are able to train much more before that overloading starts to happen and that muscle starts to be in pain and becoming inflamed. So you win a lot more comfort and you can train much more before those overloading injuries are starting. And an important disclaimer, that does mean though that even with perfect technique, you can experience exactly the same pains if you overdo it. But the capacity on which that happens is much higher, so you can train much more before that happens. So let's start over now, and we start at 0 with the rowing pattern. You hang passively in here. And now if we initiate the movement, we want to think of bringing the elbows down, and we want to maintain a neutral shoulder position. So when we start rowing, we don't let the whole shoulder joint shrug up. We bring the upper arm back in the socket of the shoulder and we row up. So what we're actually doing is we just ignore our scapula and we let it naturally move. So we don't let it move upwards excessively. We don't jam it back together and up excessively. We move the arm and the scapula naturally moves with it. And that is all the amount of movement that we need. So it's not about restricting movement, it's about controlling movement. You could have guessed it is exactly the same for pressing patterns as well. We don't want to restrict the movement of the scapula, we want to control it. And in order to do that, we actually don't need to think a lot about our scapulas, and we should rather focus on the movement of the upper arm. And that means we start in the push-up, same of course is true for the bench press. And when we go down, we don't move our scapula as much. We bring the arm back in the socket of the shoulder and we let the scapula naturally move with the arm, and that will lead to a bit of retraction and a bit of elevation, but really just a bit. So you don't need to force anything, you just control the movement and you don't restrict anything in the scapular region. So we start here and then we bring the arm backwards. And that's about it. I don't need to press it down and start doing like that and then tensing everything up and doing stuff like that. Naturally, I just control the movement and let my arm move backwards. So we need to learn to regulate and control movement, and we don't need to create unnecessary tightness and jamming joints together and trying to create some stability perception. That's not how it works. Just start to move properly. And of course, exactly the same applies for pull-ups, chin-ups, and dips, all the movements in that plane as well. It's about controlling movement and not restricting movement. And let me show you the difference. Just putting the mic in here, I'll try to give you a back view so you can see it a bit better. Now, I just start in a hanging position, and you can see that my shoulder blade rotates upwards together with my arm so that the socket of the shoulder also points more upwards in the direction of the arm. That means less work for the rotator cuff to do. And now I let the arm naturally move down. So I don't think a bit of my scapula. I don't want to jam it down and back. I don't want to create any unnecessary tension there. I just want to bring it naturally in downward rotation together with my arm. So, natural pulling pattern. Bit of a narrow grip. Let me widen it a bit. Natural pulling pattern. And now unnatural. I jam the shoulders down and they shrug up like that. We could also have it extreme and the other way around. We start super active and then go up. Also unnatural. Just pull. And let the scapula move in that downward rotation that you need in order to support the arm on its downward movement. And exactly the same changes and modifications will also work on the dips. I've made already tons of videos about it, but let me show you again the difference. Now I just control the movement. That means the scapula comes a bit in retraction, a bit in elevation when the arm moves backwards in a natural fashion. What I don't want to see is that unnatural. It does not move in that roughly 2-to-1 ratio. So again here, it's not about jamming the shoulder joint down, tensing it up and restricting the movement. It's about naturally controlling it. So if you are an individual that is very prone to shoulder discomfort and rotator cuff injuries, there is a very high chance that you will see one of these shown compensations or maybe also all of them in your training. So here is your task. You should record all your movements. You need to check for these compensations, and then you need to lower the weight and progressively work on your technique in order to reinstall a more natural movement pattern so that your whole shoulder joint can work much more efficient and you are less likely to go back into your overloading injuries of your rotator cuff muscles. So next to learning proper exercise technique, progressive training programming and load management are super important in order to avoid overloading injuries, which are most of our shoulder discomforts. So in order to learn that, I created the Strengths Programming course. It's an e-learning course that guides you from zero to your first professional training program in 99 videos. So you are guided step by step from goal selection, exercise selection, selecting rep range, learning autoregulative training, everything from zero to the first program with weekly live calls together with me where I will answer all your questions. And the best is, until the end of this week, we have a big Black Week sale and it is reduced 50%. So if you're interested in learning proper strength programming, then definitely make sure to get your programming course this week.